Eke, ini masana kela iko senati. Eke, eke,
senati gumma finda.
eke,
Senati gumma finda.
eke,
Senati gumma finda.
eke,
Senati gumma finda.
eke.
Senati gumma finda.
Welcome, Sophie. Welcome, everyone, to this conversation for our summit that will probably be called Composting Our Systems, or something alike, where we expect to, or we invite explorations in how we can make systems for our interactions more humane, more healthier, and better for the environment. And I'm really grateful to Sophie for being part of this interview. I've met Sophy Banks through grief tending, which has really changed my life. And she has been involved in systems in many different ways. She started as an engineer, and also exploring in depth the system of play in football, and then the systems of the brain and behavior through therapy. She's been involved in transition movement as well, and has done a lot of work around conflict and communication. So it's a real pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes, and I would like you, I wouldn't like to introduce you in depth, but if you have something that you think you would like people watching this interview to know about your path and how you've come to be here today.
I love being introduced to all of those things. I was a therapist for a long time, as well as all those other ones. And I guess what I would say about my path is it took me decades to figure out what the kind of unifying theme of my life was, but actually systems is probably it. And you could say the question that it's been, people speak about the red thread or the golden thread, is probably, why do we make systems that create unintended consequences? Why as humans do we create systems that create enormous suffering for people, for children, for everybody, and destroy the living web that we're part of and entirely dependent on for our lives? How is it possible that we do that? It's a big question. So along the way, I feel like I've gathered bits of answers, which is what I feel I want to share when I'm asked questions about systems change. So,
well, how appropriate.
Yeah,
perfect for these conversations. Yeah, so along those lines, actually, I personally feel that there is a lot that I don't want to say that it's wrong, but there's something about the system in general, like the political system, the decision making, the way we distribute our resources, something that is kind of not working. There is, as you say, there is so much pain. There's something, I would even like to say, dysfunctional about the way that we go about our lives and our interactions. So yeah, so I wonder, what's your view on that? What is that? What is not working with our system, and how do we transform that if that's possible at all?
Yeah, thank you. It's the question of our time, as we stand on this precarious edge of the future for humanity, and as so many species already are just getting wiped out. What is it that creates this system of so much harm? So in my own journey, I started out, I feel like in a way I followed a journey that I see many others following. So I started out interested in technology, trying to understand the world through science. You know, I did an engineer training with this seeking of why is the world as it is, you know, and thinking that I would find the answer through science and technology. And as my own life fell apart in various painful and challenging ways, I started to, and I also saw what was happening in British industry and met those people working professionally as engineers or in science. I guess I started to feel this kind of separation between ways of seeing the world and ways of understanding the world, and realized that science or technology wasn't going to help me understand the deeper questions that I had, and that actually the thing that had been marginalized or pushed to the background in my family and my upbringing and my training at school and at university, which was what's happening in the emotional field between human beings, what's happening inside myself, what's affecting the way that I perceive and respond to the world around me, actually had more answers to give me in this part of me that was seeking to understand. So in around my late 20s, 30s, I started my own inner journey. I slightly accidentally trained as a therapist, and I started to learn about the unconscious, and to see how much things that are overwhelming for us to feel or be in relationship with within ourselves and in the collective field actually are shaping the way that people behave, and that without an understanding of, you know, what you might call unconscious processes, actually the world is a very baffling place. But once you start to see that people's responses to their own overwhelming experiences create logical but in the present moment inappropriate ways of behaving or acting in the world makes much more sense. And now we have tools possibly that enable us to work with the real drivers for the system, but they're inner tools. You know, they're tools that are much more I mean, not exclusively, but the place where the problem is solved is the place where the problem is created, which is not in our technology. You know, our technology is a result of a specific worldview, and our politics and our so-called economics are the result of a particular worldview that arises out of distortions of thinking that are to do with the individual and inner collective state, which are not separate. So that's been kind of my life's journey in a way, is from the science and then to go to the inner. And even when I was looking at the inner, you know, as a therapist, you're working very much with a personal inner, but I was always very interested in looking at how a person is a part of the system. So family constellations was one of my trainings. Eco-psychology was one of my threads that I wove into the way that I was trying to understand things. So people in their context of human and living systems. And then I, again, you know, through curious circumstances, came to be part of the transition movement. And there actually everything came together. And I started to see that if we're talking about whole systems, we need to be speaking about the outer and the inner, and seeing how they constantly affect and shape and interrelate with each other. So we're not going to do whole systems that are about food, housing, money, the land, the water. You know, that's not whole system. That's a very partial system. We're not going to do whole systems that are about people's inner states of consciousness and conflict resolution, or just about group dynamics. When we talk about whole systems, we need to talk about all of these inner and outer, personal, relational, community, global, living systems, past and present. We need to really expand and be inclusive about what our system is. And the other kind of inclusivity, as it were, is what is conscious, what we can bring to mind, and a curiosity about what is out of awareness. What is it that might be running our system that we can't see? Because when we when we go there, we meet our inner defenses or our inner structures or our collective, inner or personal taboos that say, don't feel that, don't pick up that stone and look at what's underneath it. So that's my introduction, as it were, to what is the system. What is the system? It's inner, outer, across scale, across time, and both what's conscious and what's unconscious. And if we're not into this, probably more, for me, systems work is about always asking, and what are we leaving out now? What's being marginalized, even in our definition of what a system is? And if we don't start with that question and keep that question in mind, that bit that we're leaving out is the bit that's going to make our movement ineffective. That's the bit that's going to sabotage the changes that we want to make. And I feel like I've seen that repeatedly in people intending good things and actually creating a repetition or a replica of the system that they're trying to change. Partially, doesn't mean that no good change has come from those organizations and movements, but actually, a change. So the one that I speak about a lot, if you're an environmental movement intending to prevent the burnout of the planet, but the people who are working in your movement are burning out, there's something about burnout that you haven't understood yet, and it's the shadow of your movement, and you won't heal the burnout of the planet until you understand the dynamics of burnout. So there's my introduction, as it were. Thank you. What a big question it is.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's good. Let's have the big question.
Yes. So there are two things arising for me. The first one is it's fear, because if that thing that we're leaving out, that we are not seeing, is what's going to put the spanner in the works, so to speak. And me coming from an idea that it's almost impossible as part of the system to see all the parts of the system. How do we put these two things together? Is there hope that we can actually see what we are missing out? Or is there always something is going to be hidden and therefore it's not going to work? Or does it even matter? It's never going to work 100%, but as you say as well, good work can go in even if it doesn't go all the way, can still be good work. How do you see that? Is there risk in not seeing everything?
The word that I want to pick up on, which I think is really central, is the word fear. So in this sort of seeking, I guess, I was interested in this question, which itself is just a framework. I like to I preface what I'm expressing by saying this is not the truth. So we can only speak about systems in partial truths, and that in itself, when we describe a system, we're making a map or a model, but we're not describing the whole system and its complexity. So I got interested in a way of looking at systems that says what's a healthy human system, or what is health within a human system, and what is unhealth within a human system, and created a body of work at the moment. It's called Healthy Human Culture, that seeks to inquire into these two states and what are the processes of change that take a healthy human system away from health, and what are the processes that restore an unhealthy, or the parts of a human system that are unhealthy, back to more health. And I tend to speak as health and unhealth, but really I mean more healthy and less healthy, with the understanding that every human system, and this I think is also helpful, has all of these four components in. It has the parts where there is some health or some more health. There's parts that are less healthy, and these change processes going in both directions are also present. And a little aside, I teach that as a model in itself, and I found a real resonance with the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. and I think Buddhism is an interesting systemic inquiry into human systems, and I think it's interesting that the Buddha started with the question, what is suffering and what are the causes of suffering, which is a powerful question, isn't it? What is it in our system that is causing unnecessary or escapable pain? It's not a question that we're really asking if our framing is about economics and politics at the moment.
Absolutely.
So I was looking for this, where do we see health in human systems? And I think there's really interesting developments that have happened since I trained as a psychotherapist, which is now more than 20 years ago, in understanding trauma, understanding the physiology of trauma and the neuroscience of trauma. And, you know, in the many different models of understanding what happens inside human beings, I feel like the neuroscience research, you know, we have the very helpful technology now to understand more of what's happening in our brain, in the chemicals that move around our bodies, that organize our perception and our behavior and our experience. And actually, you know, this is what I perceive. Is it the truth? But what I perceive is that neuroscience is tending to back up attachment theory. So of the different schools of understanding of how we form, how we become a human being from our earliest experiences, you know, some would say as far back as conception, but certainly in the womb and in the first months and few years after birth. Actually, how we become a human being and the way that our brains wire up the highways of our brain perception and responses. Attachment theory is a very helpful way of understanding that, which says we come into being through relationship and we form resilient, secure, healthy human beings by creating secure attachment. So, and when we don't have secure attachment, we tend to have patterns, you know, that are called avoidant or resistant, or there's different names for them. But, you know, one kind of pattern, which is to reject reality, to reject relationship, to be anti-dependent, you could say. And another, which is called resistant, which is the kind of clinging, trying to hold on, being needy, you know, this sort of thing. Anyway, so there are different patterns. There's a third insecure attachment, which is called disorganized, you know, where there isn't one strategy that helps us to get more of our needs met. That may be a little bit of an aside. But at the center is this sense that in order to become a healthy, resilient, grounded, self-valuing, healthily relational, socially responsible human being, we need secure attachment. We need to be held in life. We need the holding both when we're very little, and I think it's really interesting to apply it all the way through our lives, that enable us to process and digest strong emotional experiences. And so for me, that's a framework of what healthy human culture creates. And I'm interested in relating that to our nervous systems. So I might start sharing maps with you in a moment, but this idea that in a healthy culture, there's a rhythm and a flow between our two autonomous nervous system states. So we're organized by the sympathetic nervous system as we go to act, as we wake up, as we move about, as we take part in physical activity, or you know, whether it's food gathering or gardening or dancing or play or football. You know, we have our active cycle, and then we come back in and we have the part of our being and our rhythm that's organized by parasympathetic, where we digest experiences, where we come back much more into relationship, where the focus is on soothing, integration, rest and digest is the name of the parasympathetic nervous system. And in a healthy culture, we'll have structures and processes that support this natural flow, and we'll be in those nervous system states without stress. And I think I want to emphasize what a radical concept that is in our society. That our sympathetic nervous system, if you look it up, if you put it into a search engine, it will tell you that the sympathetic nervous system is a fight-flight system. And that is the sympathetic nervous system in its emergency state, driven by fear. So here's that word fear picked up. But actually, the sympathetic nervous system is what helps you stand up from sitting. It's what wakes you up in the morning. It's what gets you to go and play with your friends, to have a game of football, to enjoy dancing. It's not necessarily a stress state. So there's a possibility of a ground state where human beings feel confident, trusting, at ease, safe in their context. And into that comes, you know, life brings us stresses. So we move from that ground state into stress. Oh, I think it's helpful to know, as a social, you know, research on primates shows that the majority of stress isn't the predator. You know, we had that in our evolution, where our body's wired first to do freeze, the reptilian response, the second mammalian response, which is fight flight, you know, which is responding to the predator. But as social animals with a very powerful frontal neocortex part of our brain, we have another layer of stress response. This is Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, which is about negotiate, which is communicate, which is, and this evolved because most of our stress actually comes from peer-to-peer, you know, from within our tribal group. It's not even the competition of the other, the enemy. It's, do I still belong? Have I got a place? Because my entire life is dependent on being a part of a tribal group. You know, humans don't survive on their own. We survive through cooperation, collaboration, and mutual care. And that's how we evolved, you know, which is why attachment is central to our existence. Yeah. So here's a quite a long explanation of what I think healthy culture includes. A ground state which is relaxed. Stresses that come in, our first response, this is polyvagal theory as I understand it, is negotiate, communicate. If we can't resolve, you know, conflict resolution, if we can't deal with the situation, or if it's a bigger physical existential threat, like there is danger, we'll try to flee, and then if we can't flee, we'll fight, and if we can't fight, then we freeze. So there's a hierarchy of stress responses, and all of this is part of healthy culture, because life is either challenging, sometimes dangerous, or we could say exciting and interesting, because these challenges also help us to grow and develop our confidence and our competence at dealing with life. So we need stress. Stress is not a bad thing. But in order for stress to be developmentally positive, there needs to be enough holding, enough competence. And if we get into a state, especially a freeze, where we've experienced that state of terror, of existential threat to our being, which might be because we're being attacked by someone in our tribe more powerful than us, such as our mother or father, or a leader or an adult when we're a child, or we've been physically or sexually assaulted, for instance. So we've got an overwhelming experience that has caused us to shut down, or there's the tremendous energy of fight flight that we couldn't release in the moment. There needs to be what I call the return path. And I believe if you look at indigenous cultures, traditional cultures, that sustained, relatively peaceful, relatively joyful existences where young people and adults and elders feel a sense of confidence and belonging, you'll find somewhere woven into what I would call their social technologies, the return path. And it may be a trance dance, it may be a grief ceremony, it may be a sweat lodge. You know, there's all these different ways that somebody, or even groups of people, the warriors returning from a violent interaction, you know, women recovering from an overwhelmingly challenging birth, whatever it is, somebody coming from a
journey.
A journey, yeah, that's right. So something that has overwhelmed your system to cope in the moment is taken by the healers and put into that ceremony, or those ceremonies happen every week, or, you know, at the changing of the season. So these structures are woven in to the rhythm and the routine of the people that we shake out. And we know now, through Peter Levine and many other people's work, there's a physical element to releasing that internal state. There's often an emotional discharge that happens. We may need to release sound and tears and, you know, all kinds of things. And there may be a cognitive element. So the cognitive element is something like we reinforce the belief that there is a way back. When something overwhelmed me, I'm held by something bigger: spirit, nature, the elders, the ceremony, my tribe, my people, my community, my family, and they help me to come back to a place of goodness and uprightness. So I shake that out, and now my system can relax again, and I'm back in a state of relaxed action, mobility, taking part, having fun, contributing, working, and digesting, rest and digest. So all of this for me is what healthy human culture includes, and that return path is absolutely essential to it. And I feel like in the West, we've been catching up to that, you could say, in our understanding of trauma in the past 10, 15 years. You know, there's always been attempts to create more health. And I imagine there have been many traditional ceremonies and rituals that we may or may not even know about that have happened in European history over the years that have been lost or eroded, or maybe they're still going. You know, maybe the place in southern England, in, you know, where they burn an effigy of somebody as the darkness comes in, you know, that's part of the kind of cleansing that helps us to release whatever's built up over time. So, you know, I think we still have traces of some of these. There's that place in Italy where they have that huge orange fight, or Tomatis Lake. You know, we get rid of some of the pent up charge and aggression by these contained social rituals. And maybe football is part of it as well. You know, the whole physical expression of football. I suspect watching football doesn't quite do what you need to,
but playing it perhaps does.
I think it certainly did for me for a long bit of my life. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if would you like to show that diagram?
Yeah. So for me, this is the ground state of moving between here, the parasympathetic nervous system states, rest and digest, and going out. Some people said, why isn't it a circle? It could be a circle. And, you know, this could be the medicine wheel, you know, that you see in many Native American traditions and other traditions. This could be the flow between, you know, work in the day, rest at night, ceremony. Many different forms. But for me, this is a ground state for human beings. And here's the more complete healthy human culture. This is, again, for individuals, where from this ground state, there's stress comes into the system. First of all, we negotiate, communicate, and then there's fight and flight, and then fight, then freeze. And part of a healthy culture is this return path, holding and support to release stress physically, emotionally, and reinforcing our sense of the world that it fundamentally holds and supports us to deal with whatever life brings. So this is healthy human culture, full stop. You know, so then the next sort of paragraph, as it were, is what happens to take us out of this, or what is unhealthy culture? What are the forms that we get into with unhealthy culture? So let's look at this next bit. What happens when the return path fails? And for me, this is the crucial bit of human existence that we need to understand. I don't know if we could ever trace you know, the many ways that we come out of this state of healthy culture. Maybe there are climate disasters or natural disasters, and maybe there are, you know, the obvious one that comes maybe later in human history is invasions, wars, colonization, where a whole culture is decimated by the arrival of you know, violence, but also smallpox, or, you know, something that takes out 90% of your population. So the healers are gone, the elders are gone, the people that hold the structures. Maybe your culture is deliberately eradicated when the colonizing force comes and denies you the right to meet, to hold your ceremonies, to speak in your language. But I think this can happen, you know, probably in other ways. And one of them is that it's a simple, humans are so successful, we outstrip our culture. Anyway, let's not spend too long worrying about it. You know, there are ways in which a culture that has these systems loses them. And it's not an individual experience, it's a societal experience, because this capacity to come back out of high stress states is held in the culture, not as an individual practice. So here we are, post-shock recovery fails, what happens next? And I'm going to shift scales at this point and speak about, no, this is an individual because we're looking at nervous system. So I see that these nervous system states show up in our culture as archetypes. And it's such a fundamental part of how our perception and our experience is organized. You know, I think the archetypes that relate to these nervous system states are interesting. And as I was looking at this and inquiring into this, I felt like I found some representation of these inner states across many different cultures. So here are some of the ways that this that I've seen it. Is in my psychotherapy training, we talked about will and love as two archetypes, and the definition of a healthy human being is that we had a healthy will and a healthy love, you know, capacity for will and a capacity for love, and that they were in connection. We weren't just about will, about being driven. We weren't just about love and relationship. You know, we could speak. So, you know, in the Chinese tradition, it's not my tradition. I don't know the depth of it, but I found yin and yang. And again, the definition of health, the first definition of health, there's much more complexity, is that yin and yang are both present in the right amounts, and that there's a relationship or a movement between them. We don't get stuck in one, and that both are present. And this is fire and water, comes from Sobonfu, one of the people I consider my very important teachers, who was from the Dagara people of Burkina Faso in Western Africa. So she was growing up in an intact indigenous land-based culture, and in their cosmology of 5 elements, fire and water are the 2 things that need to be balanced. So here are some, you know, we could talk about organizational work, task and relationship. You know, there's other ways that these archetypes show up. In Paulo Freire's work, you know, the action bit of the cycle and the reflection bit of the cycle. We need both in order to create healthy systems. So here's a more cultural view, still with the return path. And then here's a sort of proposition or you know, questions like, what happens to a system when we lose the return path? And what I see is that now we have people in this system who are being partly at least organized by the states of fight flight, you know, or negotiate, but there's a stress state. And some people will be more, will find it easier to access fight flight because developmentally that's what they had, or their culture encourages their particular group, like, you know, the elite men or the you know, the tall ones or whatever it is, their group is encouraged to take that position, or it's their personality structure. Other people will be more in the position maybe of fawning, which we see as one of the stress responses, that, you know, just trying to placate and appease those with power, or complete freeze, paralysis. So this is a summary. It would take a lot longer to explain this in more detail, but now we have culture, not just individuals, but whole culture being organized by these underlying stress states. And this red shock experience, whether that's developmentally or whether that's a historic or present cultural experience of slavery, of invasion, of colonization, of the rape of the women, of a war experience, collective experience of overwhelming terror, violence, poverty, the inability for life to go on in good ways, without the healing and the holding to process that through our systems as it comes. Now we're in a completely different cultural landscape where there's a collective belief that there's not enough holding, a collective belief that we're just in a fight to survive, and we have to strategize to survive, because there isn't enough goodness, there isn't enough love, there isn't enough attachment to get us back into that state that I believe we're wired to expect and to recognize, where we can just relax, where we can sink into the arms of the people who love and hold us, where the elders are taking care, those with power, our leaders are taking care of everybody in the system, not just themselves. So here for me is one way of seeing the elements of unhealthy culture. And I'm talking a lot, but I just want to name some of the characteristics of this that I think we can recognize in what's happening in our world today. So one of the characteristics of this is those identified with power serve the interests of power and no longer put their strength and capacity, this sympathetic nervous system as a cultural archetype, energy, power, strength, ability, production, great, yeah. That energy is no longer serving the care and the well-being of the whole. It's being used as a survival mechanism to preserve the survival of those with power. So preserve those who have the capacity. Part of what will be going on as part of the structures of those who do that, with this belief that there is not enough holding, life has failed me, and my ancestors, this underlying unconscious belief is that I don't want to experience my vulnerability. I don't want to do inner work. There's a defense against inner work in this cultural structure, because if I sit on a cushion and start to feel what is in my body or what is in my feelings, I'm going to touch this place here, where I was overwhelmed, where I was helpless, where I was powerless, where there was nothing I can do. And there is nothing in the world that helps me to manage that. So all I can do is try to keep going, using my power to protect myself and possibly those, my loved ones, those that are close in. So these people, or this part of myself, because it's also, this dynamic is also within me, as well as polarizing people in societies, as well as polarizing white people and black people, for instance, the wealthy, the poor, Europe versus Africa, however at every scale it's organizing this polarizing. These people don't want to do inner work. They'll rubbish inner work. They'll feel distant from and create belief systems that separate them from the vulnerable. So the refugees, the homeless, the poor black people, the women, are nothing to do with me, and it's okay for me to persecute them rather than help them. So over here we get these frames that we see in the kind of neoliberal discourse, where if you're poor, it's your own fault. Where in order to belong you have to work hard, and there's this lie that if you work hard you can succeed. If you work hard, a few people can succeed, and get out of poverty, but the majority of poverty is being continually pushed back as those with power use their power and strength to preserve privilege. So now, for me, we have a system that explains not just what happens to us as individuals, but also systems of power and oppression. And the difference. Go on.
And the separation that actually it's part of the system.
That's right. That's right. You know, and I just want to say, you know, there are some people that this part of the system where those of us that experience freeze, you know, or that part in me that tends to collapse, that feels paralyzed in the face of aggression. You know, we can see that also as a societal dynamic. I think a lot of our illnesses, psychiatric illnesses, psychological illnesses, like paranoid schizophrenia, for instance, people that are, I think chronic fatigue is down here, people that are exhausted, collapsing, overwhelmed by pain, anxiety and depression, you could see as a symptom of this system, the ones that are holding that, that are holding that for the society, as it were. And I think it's good to say, you know, that the resistance movements, where there's civil rights, you know, feminism, where people that are being pushed into powerlessness are organizing to restore that, is not here. We're back over here. So where people are using their capacity, using their voice, their bodies to attempt to heal and restore a sense of power used for the well-being of all, to challenge this systems of exclusive and pathological privilege. You know, that so again, in the human system, we've actually got all of this, you know, and I think this is the most helpful thing to say is there's no system which doesn't contain both the healthy parts and the unhealthy. And the question isn't which is it, it's where is their health, where is their unhealth, and how can we recognize the unhealth? How can we feel what that's like in our meetings, in our physiologies, in our bodies, in our actions, in our messaging and the communications we have? And how can we keep inquiring into that and asking, how can we reframe, repurpose, redesign, reorganize, change, you know, the system out there, but also the system in here, in our own movements for change, so that we're continually trying to increase our own health, create our own systemic change, so that we can be more effective in creating systemic change for the world. So this is the, you know, end of diagram, but this is the bit that we're trying to create. How do we recognize, and this purple pathway brings us back from the whole of this system back to more health, more grounded, more holding, action from a place of love, love supporting action, health, more health.
Without stress, or less stress, not without.
With joy, exactly, grounded in a state of self-confidence, of mutual trust, of care for the whole, of putting power in service, power as service, leadership as service, not as, you know, people say ego, but, you know, not as preserving my own needs at the expense of others or the needs of a few.
Wow. I love seeing that diagram. I've seen it made in paper live, and it's just fantastic.
But there's quite a charge to that diagram.
Yes.
Because we're naming trauma, and when we speak to these different parts in us, I think it activates them. So I can feel
me too.
Places in me that are activated by speaking about these different experiences. You know, and I mean, maybe this is a really important bit of the talk, is to include, of this interview, is to include that we respond. You know, there's a physiological, emotional response when we see this material, because this is not a theory. You know, this is, it is a theory, but it's like it comes out of my lived experience and seeing other people's lived experience, including things that have really hurt them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe this is actually really healthy to have as part of the interview, and I will invite whoever is watching this not to skip over, but to take a moment to take a deep breath, and maybe, as Peter Devine would suggest, just shake a bit. I actually feel I could really feel the it's not poison, but I can feel the tension in my spine at the moment. So thank you for that.
Yeah, so let's us have a pause and invite
Yes.
the listener to take a pause at this moment. Listen to your body, you know, feel how your breath is, you know, just take some time to really feel what's holding and supporting you. Maybe have some water, good to keep drinking as we keep doing this. So let's just pause for a moment and invite our listeners to do that as well.
I invite everyone to take this as a tool, a resource to use in any type of interaction whenever things get a bit stressy. Welcome back from that beautiful, delicious, yummy break.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much as well for that diagram. And I find it really helpful to see the connection between what I feel in my own body and in my experience of how I've reacted to stress and trauma, and how that really resonates with what I see outside in the systems. So that was one of the questions I had, is how do we make that connection? Now, if you want to add something more about that, please do that. If not, I would really like to know how you think we can reinforce that in your diagram, that purple arrow of returning back to the healthier part of the system.
I want to speak a bit to this word trauma that's in that diagram. That, for me, a useful definition of trauma is that it's an injury that hasn't been repaired. You know, and that could be a physical injury, so, you know, an assault, a rape, an attack, a fright, you know, something that doesn't even have to be a physical injury, but where I'm taken to the place where I'm in terror for my physical safety. They also can be an emotional, you know, being shamed, being attacked or criticized in front of other people. So some experience has happened which has overwhelmed my capacity to cope in the moment. And there hasn't been the opportunity, that return path has been missing. There hasn't been an opportunity to shake out the terror. And within that experience of trauma, there are some things that seem to me to generally reside in the landscape of that experience. One is that I feel alone. There isn't enough support to hold me. The second is that it's pervaded by terror. So as I come close to that, I will feel a lot of fear. And another one is powerlessness. I didn't have the strength to either stop or prevent what was happening or to escape from it. So this is part of the, you know, what you might call the anatomy of trauma. And this is part of what that top right-hand side, you know, that whole right-hand side of the system doesn't want to feel. And as soon as we come towards that, we start to feel, if we create a situation in which we get near that landscape of trauma, we'll start to feel the beliefs that set up of, I'm going to be overwhelmed, I won't survive, I'm on my own, there's not enough support. And it's, you know, so part of the return path is creating enough support, enough holding, and enough cognitive understanding that when we start to encounter that, these feelings will come up, and they're normal and they're part of the healing process, and they're not true anymore. in that moment it was true when this event happened, or this landscape of events happened culturally or in my family or in my childhood, whatever it was. So anyway, part of understanding what trauma is this part of the return path is creating the conditions in which there's enough loving support, holding, understanding for those feelings to be experienced, and then not to run what happens next. So making a bigger holding than the experience. And the second, or another thing to add about this landscape of trauma, is in our Western, very individualistic culture, we locate trauma as an individual experience. I'm a traumatized person, you know, or this group of people who've been in war or been sexually abused are traumatized people. And actually a reframing that I really got when I read Renee Linklater, who's been doing a lot of research around Indigenous people in Canada, North America, is that trauma is a cultural landscape. So if we're speaking in systems term, trauma is not an individual experience, you know, that causes something. You could say trauma is an emergent property of a system that's being organized by particular aspects of the human body, mind, emotional field, when it's been traumatized, you know, when it's had its own trauma. But I think it's helpful to relocate trauma out of the individual into the landscape. And the reason is that the prevention of trauma, the place where the problem is not in the individual, it's in the cultural landscape that's lost its healing technologies. So for me, that's a really helpful, and it was quite a shift for me to feel that reframe. Yeah. So
one thing that sorry,
yeah,
so one thing that is arising for me as well is that when we have that that group on the right-hand side of the diagram of the fight flight, that people who are really, or it's not only people, but people who are really very productive, very driven as part of their response to that stress. So they're in that hyper productivity state and violence or aggression. We probably reward those traits as what we want in our leaders. So the more that gets rewarded, the more it happens. And also it's part of the re-traumatization perhaps, or there's part of those people who is not being allowed to exist. So I can imagine that is quite hard on the individual level. So that may lead to even more disconnect to wanting to change. So I see that as something very dangerous, but part of it, in my own experience, is not wanting to go away from that state, because that's my identity. So I have the feeling my society has been really strict about who I am, and I don't have choices to be very dynamic in that. Not anymore, but that's how I grew up. It's like, oh, you are like that. It's not something that you are allowed to change. Which I think now it's not the same for me. But so I'm wondering how much of being afraid of losing my identity is part of people not wanting to do inner work or look at their trauma.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, and I've been reminded of this. You know, so I speak as somebody who has a lot of privilege. You know, globally, in this culture, you know, in this moment, and part of what privilege gives you is the freedom to be in touch with the pain of the system or not. And it's not that there isn't pain, there isn't body trauma in the bodies and the emotions of those who have privilege, but it's like privilege gives you the possibility of comfort in this moment, or distraction, or, like you say, an identity where I'm entitled to have these things, regardless of the cost of that to other people, or to the planet, or to future generations. You know, here's a way of understanding privilege that's not just about power or wealth, but that's about the distribution of pain in the system. So one way of understanding systems of oppression is that it's a survival strategy where those who can grab the most strength through their social power or their weapons technology or something else can deal with their own the discomfort and the historic unmanageable, overwhelming pain of not having been held to come fully into life in a good way. I can deal with that by putting it into the body of a woman, if I'm a man, through sexually assaulting her, or through dominating behavior in meetings or whatever, at home, in the workplace. As a white person, I can put that into the body of Black people through creating extractive, exploitative and violent systems of colonization or capitalism or workplace lack of safety or whatever it is. So here's a way of understanding systems of power and oppression that relate more to the unconscious layers that are happening. And a way of understanding privilege, of being aware of getting away from pain. So it's not that the pain isn't being felt in the system, you know, and I've heard, you know, young Black women, or, you know, the people that are, I can feel it touching my emotions, those that are, whose behavior is pathologized because they're expressing grief. Because they're in touch with that pain and they're labeled as depressive. And you know, what we don't do is to say, let's hear about your anxiety. Let's collectively make space to hear about that. Let's hear about the grief that's dragging you down every day, or so there's a pathologizing. That's one of the ways we deal with pain in the system, is to pathologize it, to put a label on it. You know, it's in the American, you know, diagnostic manual, and now you're labeled as this. And now we don't have to deal with you as representing a part of the system that is expressing how much pain and suffering this whole system actually creates. What are the other ways that we deal with pain in this Western modern, you know, I'm in England, English culture? We give people drugs. You know, we say, here, take a tranquilizer. You know, take pain relief. What a great name! Physical pain, emotional pain. How else do we do it? You know, we support people in their addictions. So we market. You know, it used to be cigarettes, you know, as ways that people would self-soothe to manage their levels of stress that were unmanageable. But we sell people sugar or alcohol, or we sell people an identity, you know, have this identity, buy this identity with this product that will temporarily make you feel a bit better about yourself. So the whole marketing industry is predicated, you can say, on this model where people essentially feel worthless, powerless, disconnected, you know, a level of pain, and products, capitalism provides us with products that give us a fix, you know, literally like the addict's fix. You'll feel better for a moment and then the pain will come back, which is great for our GDP, because then we can sell you the next product. So somebody in one of the inner transition groups said, you know, inner work, connection, community, creating spaces where we feel deeply connected to one another, that is the antidote to capitalism. You know, appreciating and valuing each other's contribution, recognizing the goodness in each other, offering a space where people can bring and express their pain and move through it, not get stuck in it, but move through it, and use it as a medicine that helps us to reconnect with ourselves, with our truth, the truth of the pain and the suffering that the system is causing, and with each other. So, you know, we're starting to point to what are the shapes of that return path. And I just want to acknowledge one other bit, that I think a useful place that's good to talk about is frames. Let's speak about that. But the difficulty in healing and creating systemic change for this system is not to persuade the people that are experiencing the pain in the system. So there may be a job to do about understanding that pain, about reframing it, that it's not a personal pathology, that you're feeling depressed or anxious in these times. It's completely appropriate to be feeling that. It's a healthy response to this system, you know, which is exactly Joanna Macy's work. You know, we need to feel and honor our pain. And then when we've had the shift, seeing with new eyes, where we see the system more clearly for what it truly is, because we've spoken the truth about it, then we want to act, you know, and we don't just want to act for ourselves, we want to act because part of feeling that pain is we see that we're connected, we're interconnected, and we're part of the whole, whether we're suffering, whether we have capacity, you know, or both in our own mixtures. But the people that are difficult to persuade into systemic change are exactly like you were saying, those with an identity of power and privilege, who are inured, you know, who are immune from feeling the pain, who are protected from the pain by their bubble of privilege, you know, and it's not all white people and it's not all men, you know, but those who have a comfortable life within this system, because they have the least capacity, you know, here's white fragility or male fragility, they have the least capacity for experiencing and managing pain because they've been protected from feeling it, and they've actually been, you know, sold or taught this identity that they shouldn't, they're entitled not to feel it, and underneath is, you know, not just a reluctance or, oh well, that's not me, but a terror that everything in their world is going to fall apart if they come into contact with it. Everything about, like you say, identity, but actually survival. It's underneath that feeling that I am completely unresourced, I will simply break down, you know, and there will be no hope, you know, which is, you know, you can say the position of the addict, that without my fix, life is completely unmanageable and unbearable. You know, and, you know, making another link, that first statement of Alcoholics Anonymous, of we admitted that our lives had become unmanageable. The truth in this system is that there's an element of our lives that are unmanageable, however much privilege we have. And when we speak that truth, it opens the gateway to the possibility of freedom from that, of being run by the destructive, harming parts of us that are protecting my life at the expense of everything else, you know, costing everything, costing everything for future generations. Another deep breath.
Yeah, I'm also feeling, I'm feeling really emotional right now. And it's not only about the pain that I feel for the system or for in the system, but also when you were saying about those social technologies, as you call them, of being held by our community, being witnessed in our pain, all that, it just, the longing for it is so strong in me, as that not being something special, but part of my life and our life, that, whew. And I'm just as an aside, I'm also very aware of that privilege, in quotation marks, that those people who have been in power and through their power being not in contact with their pain, what a loss, what a horrible loss, never to have felt grief. I mean, I can't imagine how a life can feel full without experiencing that. So it also fills me with compassion towards the people that I sometimes see as privileged and having a better life, and recognizing that they are missing something really big.
Yeah, so it's lovely, isn't it? But when you say that, I imagine how that would land in some of the people that I know. It's like, well, I don't want grief, and how pervasive this belief is that grief is an unwanted thing, and it's not how I experience it, but on the whole, I see that. But the flip side of that, isn't it, is those people, and it's in me, have never felt really held. They've never really felt held, welcomed, seen, loved, belonging, and that's, that they go together.
Absolutely.
So and I've, sometimes I've asked people in my family, elders in my family, did you ever have a relationship where you felt really safe and secure? And they said no. And they haven't regarded that as exceptional. That their parents never felt truly safe and secure in a relationship or held in a community. And I've worked with clients, and again, their experience at work is that they're constantly stressed about whether they're performing, but also in their families and in their relationship. There's often this element of, I can show up to some extent, but to some extent I'm transacting my needs, your needs, or I'll do this for you. There's some extent to which we can't fully show up. And I've never lived in a culture where people were living like that. So it's a belief that I have that is possible. And when I heard Sabomfu speaking, there's very few, especially women, there's not many Indigenous teachers that grew up still in an intact culture. And I'm not romanticizing the Dagara people. Like, there's all kinds of ways that they have their own shadow. But as a woman, what I saw is how she carried herself in her body was something that I had never seen in Western women. A confidence in her power to be present, to expect to be listened to feel safe from sexual violence, and to feel supported and held by elders, by her community, and by spirit. That was what I saw in how she spoke and how she responded and how she moved in her body. That was very powerful for me. There was a taste of it, I would say, in my football team. I think I was very, very lucky in my football team to have that sense of, all women supporting each other's physical strength and physical competence in a very closely knit, mutually supportive group of women. And again, I feel like I've met very few women in this culture that have had something like that. But yes, you're right, isn't it? There it is in those who have a lot of privilege, the missing, and I sometimes talk about, this line of what back to that very first model I spoke about, what is it that pulls us into life? What says, come in more, Dita, come in more, show up more. And beautiful Brené Brown's, her work about intimacy. In order to create intimacy with another, but with myself, with life, I need to be able to bring my vulnerability, and to do that I need to feel safe. So what is it that allows us to, or encourages us, or invites us to say, come in more, be more intimate with life, with this body, with this experience? And what is it that pushes us away? And I think you can see we're navigating that all the time, and our autonomous, sympathetic, our perception, this is Stephen Porges again, is constantly navigating, is this safe? Shall I come in more? Is this not safe? And it's not a physical safety often, it's an emotional safety. How is this field of relationships? And anyway, we're moving on to this last bit that I want to speak about, to do with frames. You know, I think you can, it's what I really saw. I saw it in myself, in my own journey, and I saw it with clients working one-to-one. And then I've seen it in groups as well, how we can be on that left-hand side of the diagram, feeling relative safety. These people are my friends and allies. I'm coming forward, I'm coming in more. And then something will happen in the meeting and poof, it's not oh, we've moved a little bit. It's like suddenly we flipped over to now this room is full of people where I'm not safe, you know, maybe we don't have the resources, everything we're doing is pointless, we'll never make any difference, we're all completely exhausted, but we've got to keep, you know, it's like suddenly we flip into another whole frame, you know, that in Starhawk's writing, I think, you know, this is what I understand, she calls it bad reality. So we flip from good reality, and it's not a gradual, oh, it's like suddenly boof, and that can happen. You know, a story, we had a transition town.ness meeting that was going really well. The project was right in the early days, was expanding, masses of people were coming in, you know, literally dozens of projects were taking off, and open spaces and this and that and food and housing and inner transition and arts and education, like all this stuff. And somebody came into a core group meeting and said, the council are never going to allow us to do anything significant. We might as well give up and become a campaigning group. Oof. And it was like this person, you know, unintentionally, but he'd carried a sense of powerlessness out of a council meeting, and he brought it, and it's like a dropping a fear bomb, a powerless bomb into our meeting. And now I think I would have the facilitation insight to catch it. In that moment I didn't, and the whole of the meeting was derailed, because this feeling of fear that actually everything we're doing is pointless, which was a frame which existed in all of us. Everyone in that room had that experience from childhood, or as, you know, the people trying to change a system but unable to do so, even though we were making an incredible difference. You know, the results of our actions were all around us. Something flipped internally in us, and we went into that fear-based, powerless frame. So I want to just speak to that a bit, if that's okay. You know, I know I've spoken a lot, but I want to say, for me, these two sides of the diagram exist as frames within us. So if we're lucky enough, we'll have had some experience of that left-hand side, where we feel some security in our attachment, some feeling of being welcomed as we are, some sense that we're good enough, that there is enough resource, that my needs, my actions have an effect on the world around me, you know, which is the root of empowerment. So most of us will have some of that experience, but we'll also have the experience where we weren't justly treated, where power in our family and our school was abused, where we weren't listened to, where our needs were disregarded or persecuted, you know, where we had to become the bully in order to get any sense of power in a system at all, whatever it is. So, you know, we had to occupy persecutor or victim or rescuer positions, you know, which you could say is one way of understanding that right-hand side. So we've got both, and they exist in us as really deep frames: secure attachment, insecure attachment. You know, the world is okay and trustworthy and safe, and I can come forward. The world is frightening, persecuting, full of scarcity and competition, and I either come forward with aggression to fight, or I flee, I run away, or I freeze, or I'm constantly negotiating. You know, how can I get this conversation, this relationship, this group, this will get, you know, how can I get some of my needs met, because I'm not going to, you know, be fully welcome. So what I want to speak to is about language and communication, and this brings in George Lakoff's work, which I think is super helpful. I think people working for the neoliberals, you know, and George Lakoff speaks about the unbelievably well-funded very long-term think tanks that I think have absolutely some model that is like this. They understand cultural trauma and the deep frames that exist within us as individuals and collectively. And they understand that in order to win, you know, what George Lakoff calls a strict father narrative, in order for that narrative to continue to grow and dominate, you know, they know what they need to do, and what they need to do is to provoke people into that inner frame where I'm powerless, or in order to have power, I have to use aggression, where I'm worthless, you know, unless I conform, where I don't have any entitlement other than by serving the needs of the masters. You know, like there's a whole frame that he describes as strict father. You know, it is gendered. You know, I've you can see on my map, I don't gender those archetypes, but it is gendered. In, you know, it's mostly men that are the leaders, or women who behave like that, you know, super toxic, distorted quality of, I don't even want to call it masculine, but I'm going to call it strength. So he describes that as strict father. So all Facebook, you know, need to do is have an algorithm that keeps on supporting polarization, that keeps on supporting charged emotional responses rooted in fear or aggression, for that whole narrative to go on being perceived as the truth about the world. You know, and that's other bits to that. Let's say other bits to that are: money is more important than life. The economy is more important than the children. That the projects and the actions we do as part of the transition movement are more important than the relationships we form in our community. Right. So part of that frame is that the distortion of strength and action is takes this at the center, and love and relationship are marginalized. So we need to not include that in our messaging. We need to not say, you know, which is what I saw, it doesn't happen so much, but in the transition movement, our leaders saying, we do inner transition so that our projects are successful. No, we need to do our projects so that we're holding everybody in life in our communities. The economy serves life. The economy serves mothers holding their children, and fathers holding mothers holding their children. And we've got the whole thing inside out about what should serve what in Western culture. I would say because of this trauma in relation to loving relationship and what life really is about. So in order to, part of the frame, there are these processes we can do. You know, we've mentioned grief tending, conflict transformation, you know, circles where we just sit and we hear the truth of our system. You know, I think the women's movement is a beautiful example where women came together and spoke about their pain. And what they realized is that their pain wasn't a personal pathology or a personal experience. It was a systemic, emergent property of patriarchy, that women felt shamed sexually, felt, you know, confined by the roles they were allowed to inhabit, felt angry, felt despairing, felt whatever. They made a new meaning out of their pain by hearing each other. And then they went out to change the law, to set up domestic refuges, to domestic violence refuges. You know, they, from that deep understanding and insight into how the system worked, action came. So this is one way of creating systemic change, is, you know, and Black Lives Matter is part of this, the Me Too movement. You know, if we make meaning of our pain as a systemic thing rather than a personal pathology, that's part of what can help create it. But the other one is that in our progressive movements, we really, really pay attention to the frames that we're using, and we don't repeat, you know, what Lakoff would call strict father frames. We don't put the economy at the center. We don't put jobs at the center. We put life at the center. We put children and women and men and parents and, you know, those that are holding life at the center, and the world of work serves that. you know, and I want to acknowledge, you know, I saw this most clearly for the first time in the Art of Mentoring, and it's a view of what peace is. This is how I understood it from John Young, who was giving this teaching from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. You know, one of the very few stories that I've come across where a deteriorating, increasingly violent culture made the transition to a sustaining culture of peace. You know, there are very few. These stories are important.
Yes.
You know, and part of that, one of the components of that story, it's a story that takes a long time to tell, and I think it's so precious, and I don't know enough to speak about it with any authority. But one of the components is we need to allow ourselves to feel the grief in the system, you know, and that's part of why I do grief tending work. You know, it's not the only bit that I think is needed, but I think one component is that we change and we reframe our understanding of what pain is. Yeah. Oof, there's another whole lot.
Wow, this is, I don't know, it's just beautiful. This might sound odd, but I have the feeling that by speaking those words the way you do, there's a future forming itself, that at least it's moving me in that direction. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a beautiful place to come towards an end, but I'm wondering if you have something that you would like still to say, or if you have any other burning questions or
I think I can feel like, you know, the sort of the last words, you know, I'm really, it might be shaped like this. I'm really interested in love, longing, grief at the moment, you know, and maybe it's related to that diagram. I haven't quite got it yet. You know, it's like love, the health, beautiful action rooted in care, the weaving back together of these archetypes of strength and loving, of will and love, of fire and water, of action and relationship, you know, like weaving these back together, weaving them back together, putting action in service to love and not love in service to action, understanding the components of that left-hand side. So the longing in me is that when we are making our change, you know, our groups with an agenda around change, that we start by rooting in appreciation of what is already good. You know, I think a part of the shadow of change can be that we throw out everything, that we question everything. It's like an inquiry to start off with is what is already good. What do we want to build on? So we're both, anyway, we're both doing stability and change in appropriate ways. And for me, the components of the culture of that left-hand side are cultures that are rooted in appreciation, gratitude, celebration, reflection, and putting love at the center, putting care, relationships at the center, attachment. These things go at the center. So part of my longing is that when we're setting these groups up, we understand and we embed those practices that make life so delightful, taste so good in our bodies, you know, we feel so welcome. You know, not all the time, but that's the founding taste of the groups we create. Not, oh my God, we've got to change everything, we better get on with it. And then that the message we put out to the world comes from that place, not from a place of I'm going to terrify you with statistics about how bad things are. You know, because actually when we do that, we tip people into the right hand side, we tip people into fight flight, you know. So we need to understand this future that we're trying to create and how we embed it in our projects, in our groups, even in our one-to-one relationships and in our daily practice. and some of the things we did, you asked at the beginning, what are some of the things that I've been part of or seen in Transition Town to Wholeness? I think the Heart and Soul group that I was part of setting up, we set up one-to-one mentoring. We set up reflection spaces. We brought reflection into our project management meetings. We asked, how are we doing on a burnout scale in those meetings? We would start every meeting with a check-in saying we care not just about what we do, but how are you? Because actually your well-being is more important than getting the next action to happen. So we did some practical things. We set up home groups where neighbors could come together. It evolved into Transition Streets. We created public spaces where we would have a hot topic, like flying, and we would not set up two speakers polarized, but hold a circle in the middle and have a fishbowl conversation, and we would have public conversations around hot topics as a circle, acknowledging that we all had all the different parts of this difficult question within us. So these are some of the things, some of the things that we did, and I saw other people doing brilliant things. It's gone on. People, when there was Brexit, can we put a sofa in the civic square and invite people to just come and have a conversation about how they're feeling about Brexit, not opposing, but speaking to each other. So that's my longing, I guess, that we go deep enough into understanding these deep frames, that organized culture in our movements for change, that we don't replicate the system of harm in our groups and our projects. Water to finish with. I think that's what we need.
For the fire of transformation. And I really like what you say about this idea sometimes that we have that we need to change means getting rid of everything. And I think that's why the word composting has been arising for us for this summit, that it's not about starting from scratch, but to actually use what's there and reshape it or see what's good and see how the different components can come together and be fertile soil for something alive. And having love at the center. What a powerful, beautiful longing.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dita. Thank
This
you.
is-
Yeah, and may this gathering, really serve life in all good ways, serve what needs to be healed. Yeah. Thank you for your beautiful work on it.
Thank you as well.
Kana kuduba kana 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 ini masana kela ipo
Iko mma mfinda.